Hello everyone, my name is Lisa and I'm the Viet Vegan because I'm Viet and I'm vegan, and today's video is sponsored by Squarespace, but I'll talk more about Squarespace later on in the video. Today's video, we're making a bunch of West African dishes. I'm making red stew, fried plantains, agusi stew, and Ghanaian jollof rice. In my last grocery haul, you might have seen the West African ingredients that I got from African Market. So today is the video where I'm making a bunch of those West African dishes. So as I mentioned before, we're making red stew, agusi stew, and jollof, as well as fried plantain. So we're starting off with some black-eyed peas that I soaked for, I think about like 3 or 4 hours. Normally I would like to soak for longer, but I didn't have time. So anyway, we've got some black-eyed peas soaked, and then I'm pressure cooking them for about, I think 10 minutes here. I think you basically want to cook them until they're just tender, but you don't want them to be like falling apart soft. So I'm following Afia's recipe from the Canadian African. So this is her red stew recipe, and it is very simple and very delicious. It is like a tomato-based stew that you like kind of fry the ingredients for, and I'm prepping for both the red stew here as well as saving the rest of the ingredients for the agusi stew. I'm chopping up a Scotch bonnet pepper. I'm only going to use half because I can't really handle the spice super well, and I also took out the seeds. For the groundnut soup that I made later on, which I don't have any footage for, but I shared it on Instagram, that I used a different kind of pepper. So I'm chopping up all of the aromatics, so that includes bell pepper, red onion, ginger, Scotch bonnet pepper, and we're blending that in the blender. And I think normally you would use like earthenware to like really grind that down, but I don't have that, so I'm using a blender. And Afia uses a blender in her recipe, so that's what I'm doing. So to start the cooking process, I'm heating up some red palm oil and the red onion that I've sliced. So half the onion is sliced in pieces for the stew, and then the other half is blended into the aromatic situation, whatever this is in the blender, whatever you want to call this. So for anyone who's asking about the ethical ramifications of using red palm oil, Afia has a really great post about it. So I'll leave a link down below if you want to read more about it. But like red palm oil and like the palm oil that you often see in terms of like orangutans are two different things. So I'll leave that link down below for you to see it. To cook this recipe, Afia says to caramelize and cook down the onions and then fry up the tomato paste. I usually freeze my tomato paste from the little cans because like I'll only use like 1 or 2 tablespoons, and then it's like, what am I going to do with that? So I usually just freeze my tomato paste in cubes, and so I usually do like 1 or 2 tablespoons of tomato paste. Personally, tomato paste is one of those things where I'm like 1 or 2 tablespoons, like does it really matter if you use more than 1, more than 2? It's more flavor, you know what I'm saying? So you fry that in with the onions, and then you add the blended concoction. When you're frying up the tomato paste, you want it to like sort of infuse with the oil and kind of get a little bit more concentrated. I mean, tomato paste is already pretty concentrated, but I understand like the idea of like caramelizing the tomato paste so that it gets like sweeter, it adds more flavor, more dimension, etc. So once you find that your tomato paste is properly cooked through, Afia does recommend that you can add like a splash of water if you find that it's getting too dry or it's like kind of burning, because you still want it to like taste good. So I don't think I added any water since my tomato paste is already frozen. It's slowly cooked over time with that. But once that is adequately cooked, then you add in your blended puree, aromatic concoction, as well as spices. And then at this point, you're also supposed to add the canned tomato sauce, but I forgot, so that's fine. So I ended up adding it after the 30 minutes of cooking covered, but again, it's fine, not a huge deal. It just made my stew a little bit more watery, but you know what? That's okay. So you're gonna cover and cook and let those flavors really infuse. You're gonna let the sauce reduce a little bit. Even if it's covered, like the steam coming out of it will reduce the sauce, so don't worry too much about that anyway. And then it's time to add the beans. So for this recipe, I actually halved Afia's recipes. Her recipe makes a lot of beans, and Eddie likes beans okay, but not nearly as much as I do. So I usually half recipes that call for more than like 1 cup of cooked beans, because otherwise it's too many beans. I also added some chopped up kale, Swiss chard, I think in spinach greens. It was whatever I had bought on sale in that grocery haul. Added about half of the box, washed, chopped up, and it was the perfect amount of greens for the stew. I think this is probably one of my favorite dishes that I've tried from Afia. The hearty beans, it's just like, it's so good, it's so spiced, it's just a very good time. Like Ghanaian flavors, just So you salt to taste. I use some table salt here for that good iodine, and I set aside, put it on simmer while I cooked the other dishes. So the next dish we're making is called agusi stew. Now agusi is like ground up melon seeds. Well, actually I think agusi is just melon seeds, but for this recipe, you grind up the melon seeds so they're kind of like this like almond meal type situation, and it absorbs kind of the liquid and the flavor and just adds like a really hearty texture to the stew. So I'm following a recipe from the Vegan Nigerian. I think traditionally this recipe is supposed to be a lot like soupier or stewier. Maybe I just added too much of the melon seed, or maybe not enough liquid. I'm not really sure. But for a vegan meaty texture, I'm using mushrooms, and I'm cooking that down with some red palm oil. And these are the vegetables that I chopped up for the red bread, but I saved for the agusi. And then this is the ground melon seeds. There was an option to buy this not ground up, but I'm lazy. Why would I create more work for myself? So I just bought it ground because I knew this was the dish that I was going to be making with it. I was blending up the aromatics, so that's bell pepper, tomatoes, scotch bonnet, and red onion, and those are like the base of the aromatics. I cooked down the mushrooms until they were concentrated and most of the water had evaporated, and then I added the aromatic stew. Instead of vegetable broth, I have water plus Better Than Bouillon vegetable paste, because I never have vegetable broth in my house, just the concentrated paste. Kind of let everything chill together, cook together to sort of like really simmer down and concentrate in flavor. So while that simmers, I am heating up a pan of canola oil, and this is for some fried plantains. And while that oil heats, I'm gonna do a little bit of cleanup. I feel like I don't really show this part of the cooking process, but I don't know if you've ever seen behind the scenes of a cooking video, but it is nothing but dishes. And sometimes Eddie is able to help me with these dishes, but usually he's working during the day. So when I'm cooking at home and I'm making content for YouTube, I'm cooking and cleaning everything mostly by myself, especially because Edward does this thing where he will only wash like one sink load of dishes, and then he'll wait for those dishes to completely dry before he washes another batch. But the rate at which I make dirty dishes is faster than his cleaning rate, so it's sometimes like I need to like catch up. So to try and not overwhelm myself completely, I am cleaning as I go. So in between things heating up, simmering, when I have like 10 minutes, 15 minutes here and there, I am doing a bit of dishes, and then while those dry, I go back to cooking. I feel like it's a habit that a lot of people don't do as often as they should, and honestly, cleaning as I go and making sure that I always have like dishes going and drying and cleaning while I'm cooking ensures that my kitchen is like cleaner overall. I have more dishes to work with, and honestly, I'm just a lot more likely to cook home-cooked food when my kitchen is already clean. But now that my aromatics have, simmered down, concentrated, it's time to add the agusi. So I'm sprinkling the ground melon seed over the stew. Again, I feel like I should have more liquid, but whatever, it's fine. And I sort of spread the melon seed over the stew part, and it kind of let it absorb the moisture. And once I feel like it's like seeped in a little bit, it's like maybe like 5 minutes, give it a stir, and then I started adding in the other half of the box of greens. One thing that I forgot to add, I feel like I should have added it when I was sort of stewing or like simmering the stew, was these fermented locust beans. Now, I believe that locust beans to West African food is like similar to miso, or like fermented soybean is to a lot of Japanese or Asian cuisine, because it's like in Korean cuisine as well, but it's like called something different. So these locust beans are really strong in flavor, and when I added this to the recipe, so the recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of fermented fermented locust beans, but honestly, I feel like it should be 1 scant teaspoon because again, maybe I just like was using not a juicy enough tomato, or I don't really know exactly, but y'all, that was some strong stuff. And it did that thing where like the inside of my teeth felt like astringent and my tongue felt huge. So I don't know if I'm allergic to it or maybe I just used too much, but Afia told me that dawa dawa, aka fermented locust beans, are very basic on the sort of pH scale. If you use a lot of it, it can sort of like have that reaction. So now I know that less is more when it comes to dawa dawa, or those fermented locust beans. But anyway, that's the dish, and now we're on to frying the plantains. Now, I had 2 plantains here. One was a lot more ripe than the other, and I thought, like, I bought them both at the same time. They looked the same when I bought them, but one ripened significantly faster than the other. And the other one is like a lot starchier, kind of more like a potato, whereas this one is more like a sweet plantain, you know, the classic, delicious, good fried plantain. Personally, I would just buy like a really nice beat up plantain. Like the more black and beat up it looks, the sweeter and more ripe it is. There's some people who prefer using like the starchier, less ripe ones, but I just find they don't caramelize as well, and I really like the sweetness in with this particular collection of flavors. I wasn't following any specific recipe for this because I just watched like a YouTube tutorial. That was actually from someone who was from Toronto, which was pretty cool. But you basically just take any neutral flavored oil and then you just fry the plantain slices until they are nice and golden and caramelized to your liking. So the 3 dishes that I just made here don't traditionally all go together. I mean, like plantain stew and agusi stew go together, and plantains and red go together, but I don't think agusi and red typically go together. There's typically rice or pounded yam or something else instead. But this is what I had, this is what I was feeling, and so this is what I made. And it was very delicious. Would make again, except I would use significantly less dawa dawa in the agusi stew. But the texture is super fun. It's like super comforting. It's like kind of like scrambled eggs almost, or like a tofu scramble. It was really good, and like this was super filling, really high in fiber, protein, minerals, and it just like makes so much food that you have good leftovers for many days. I have one more dish to make, but let's talk about today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is your go-to place to build a beautiful website without having to learn any code. There are so many different sleek templates to choose from that are always mobile-friendly, eye-catching, and super easy to use. You can add in your content, add your own domain, or buy one through Squarespace, send newsletters with their built-in email marketing tools, optimize your business by using their analytics, sell your merch. Whatever website needs you have, you can do it with Squarespace. If you have a business, a side hustle, a food blog, or need to show off your portfolio and you need your own little corner of the internet, get started today by going to squarespace.com/vietvegan and use code vietvegan to get 10% off your first order. And now it's time for the pièce de résistance, jollof. This is Ghanaian style jollof rice, and I believe there are like many different regional differences between like Nigerian jollof and Ghanaian jollof, but I'm following Afia's recipe. Afia is Ghanaian. I really like this recipe and I think it is delicious. But honestly, no matter whose jollof you're eating, it's a good, spicy, flavorful rice dish. What's not to love? Plus, Ghanaians apparently really prefer jasmine rice. And you know what? Vietnamese people also prefer jasmine rice. So, you know, same, but different. How can I argue with people who stand jasmine rice as hard as I do? To start off this recipe, we have yet another combo of aromatics blended. We're using I can't remember what kind of chili pepper I used. We didn't have any Scotch bonnets at the grocery store when I went that day, so no Scotch bonnets, even though that is normally what I would use. And I've made this recipe once before. It was kind of like an epic fail because I didn't understand the limitations of my stove, and I realized that like anything below like a 6 out of 8 on my stove is like a hot breath, whereas if you have like a 6, it's like actually a normal temperature for cooking. So this recipe is supposed to take like an hour and a half to cook, but it took me like 4 hours to cook because my stove was just hot breathing on the rice instead of actually cooking it. So anyway, lesson learned. So what's going in the blender is onion, ginger, garlic, bell pepper, some sort of hot pepper, and some tomatoes. Now, again, for Afia's recipe, I halved it because Eddie likes this rice, but he does not like it as much as this recipe makes. It's just a lot of rice to eat between 2 people. So her recipe says it serves about 6 people. I would say this probably serves close to like 8 or 10. I don't know. I would say like what I made in this pot served like 4 to 6 people. It's a big recipe. So we're starting again with some red palm oil and some onion, and then in the blender I have all those aromatics, some water, and then we blended it together. So once the onions have cooked down in the red palm oil, it is time to add the tomato paste. And I fry the tomato paste with a little bit of water because this one wasn't frozen. I cracked open a brand new can, which I immediately after froze in the little cubies as I mentioned earlier. And once the tomato paste has fried a little bit, then you add the rest of those aromatics. I use some water to sort of like loosen up any leftover aromatic blendy bits in the blender, and I cook that over medium-ish heat, covered, and you just kind of let it like, simmer, marinate in the flavors. And I believe I did yet again, forget to add some puree, but I think at that point you should also add some tomato puree. So while that simmers on the stove for about like half an hour, Afia says to season this part with like a hefty amount of salt. You want it to be like fairly salty. And then while that is simmering on the stove, it's time to rinse your rice. Now, as I mentioned before, I halved the rice recipe and I washed this jasmine rice very, very well because you want it to be fluffy. You don't want it to be clumpy or starchy, and which requires a lot of washing prior. Now it's time to add a buttload of spices. I don't remember all the spices, but it is a lot of spices. And it's like kind of like a blend of like what I associate with like Indian and Mexican spices, but it's a great time. You mix everything together, you let it simmer, you let the spices infuse into that tomato goodness. And then this is the point where I added the tomato puree because I forgot to add it before. And so I let the spices sort of simmer into that a little bit more to bring everything up to an even amount of heat. I added a little bit of water because I can't remember why. Afia's recipe is very specific about the amount of water that you add at certain points in the recipe, so please follow her recipe. Don't follow my hodgepodge situation. It is a bit of a hot mess, but at this point, everything is nice, bubbly, happy, and it's time to add the rice. So I add all the rice in. You want to stir it fairly well. I did lower the heat because it was getting kind of aggressive, and you want to stir everything in so everything is evenly coated in that good sauce. Turn the heat on low, cover that pot, and just chill out for 10 minutes. Also at this point, I remembered I needed to check the seasoning as well. Since you're adding rice and you're cooking this in the rice, you want the flavor of the sauce to be a little bit saltier because as the rice cooks, it'll absorb more of that flavor. You know what I'm saying? Rice is starchy, so you want to give it a little oomph, a little salty for that good flavor. So once you've got that seasoning on lock, cover well, and it's a great time for you to do a little bit of that cleaning, a little clean as you go. Oh, I think also at this point I added vegetable broth paste because I forgot to do it. I don't know. I'm like really terrible at following recipes. Despite being a recipe developer, I cannot follow a recipe to save my life. So do not do as I do. Do as I say. But after 10 minutes of cleaning some dishes, you're gonna lift up the lid, reveal the delicious grains, and give everything a stir. The bottom will have fluffed up a little bit, start cooking, so you want to flip everything over, make sure that the stew is nice, evenly incorporated, so every rice bit gets a good amount of that flavor. And so Afia says to put a piece of parchment paper between the pot and the lid to catch any of that extra liquid, and then you pour that off into the sink so you don't boil your rice, and so you get nice fluffy steamed rice. I don't question it. It seems to work well. It's a very good time. And I've seen Vietnamese people do this when they cook steamed rice on the stove. So, I mean, I can't argue with the method. It's a good time. You're supposed to cook this at 25 minutes at low, do another flip, and then another 25 minutes. But honestly, after the first 25 minutes of this flip, maybe because I was cooking a smaller amount, but she was pretty much cooked. 20 minutes passed, I flipped it over and I was like, wow, this rice is cooked. So I decided to eat it with some red bread. But I did put it back on the stove and put it on low and just kind of like let it steam for another 15 minutes while I was eating, and that made some delicious jollof. So that pretty much concludes my little exploration in West African cooking. I did also make groundnut stew, but as I mentioned, I only did that on Instagram. I was really hungry that day. I didn't really want to bust out my camera, so I didn't film that. But if you want me to remake that, I can probably do it. When I made it anyway on Instagram, it was like pretty low effort, so I didn't even have all like the right ingredients, so it's probably for the best that I did not film that. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope I have opened your eyes up a little bit more to some West African cooking, and so you follow people like Afia, like the vegan Nigerian, to try some West African cuisine, because y'all, their dishes are just so flavorful, so good. It's a good time. You should definitely make it. You should definitely have a try. Check out to see if you have any local African markets close to you. There's one that's like really close to me. It's like 10 minutes away. You might be surprised. It's so cool to like explore different cuisines and see, the different cooking techniques. Like for example, in West African cuisine, the aromatics are like bell pepper, tomato, and onion. Ginger, garlic is just a good time, whereas like Vietnamese ones are typically like shallots, garlic, lemongrass. Chinese is also scallion, ginger, garlic. It's so cool to see different cultures have different bases for their aromatics, and it's just a great time. Yeah, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, all the recipes that I used are linked down below. Please follow their recipes. Do not necessarily follow what I did, because I admit I did not follow them very, very well. Thank you so much for watching. Hit that like button. It really helps me out, and I hope you have a wonderful, delicious day.